Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mairead, for that, and thanks, Jennifer, for your very clear presentation. I'm Martin Donnelly, as Mairead said, and I'm here with colleague Joan Robinson. We're both architects, and we both provide assigned certifier services within Henry J Lyons Architects, along with two other experienced architects and a very experienced building surveyor. I suppose the practice made the decision in 2014 to go with this. There was kind of a mini schism among architects back then as to whether architects should provide this service or not. We said that we should, but that we should do it independently of the design function. So we get appointed as architects, sometime as assigned certifier. Most of our assigned certifier service is provided for Henry J Lyons Architects, so we're quite close, but sometimes people aren't that close. Maybe 90% of our work is with Henry J Lyons. So we're not designers as such. We work with lots of engineers. As Mairead said, I started out trying to be an engineer, but I switched to becoming an architect, so I have huge empathy for engineers. I think it's great to be here at an event like this. These are important events because we're trying to figure our way out through a system which has stuff written in black and white and then has guidelines, etc. And we're all trying to get better buildings built, safer buildings built, energy efficient buildings, accessible buildings, but also buildings that the consumer can rely on. And I think that's important as well. The consumer protection is, I think, always a factor here. We're just going to talk today, and Joan will speak mostly about how we do this, how we interpret arriving at completion with providing certification of compliance on completion. But Joan will step through our process, because if you don't start, as Jennifer said, tú smas la hanubra, if you don't start well, you won't end well. And sometimes we come across people thinking that this is something like you do in handing over a safety file. You just compile these certificates and things, but that's not the case. As we all know, if you don't ask for certification and ask people to inspect buildings and provide this, they don't do it. And you can't do it retrospectively. You don't have the evidence. So a lot of this is about providing evidence, and people think this is just box ticking, but it is in one way, but it isn't in another, because you need to do the things to provide the evidence. I think 10 years on, we should all be reflecting, we are certainly, as to how we do this better and find good systems and don't make it complex and make it accessible to everybody who participates to provide good documentation, good outcomes. I'm not going to rabbit on too much, but just a couple of reminders, maybe as intros. I mean, we have obviously the Act 1991 and 2007, which is written in black and white. We have our control regulations, SI 9 and subsequent, and that's really came from 496 of 1997, which was essentially the control regulations. They're kind of written in stone. And I think what happened in 2013, 2014 was people got frightened by what was being presented as a new system. Prior to that, don't forget, we had self-certification. That was RIAI self-certification. And this suddenly introduced an oversight on that and a statutory process of oversight. So people, I think, got a little frightened. So the whole purpose of the Code of Practice is to provide an explanation to people as to how they shouldn't be frightened and how they should provide the service. So that's ongoing work through experience all the time, I think. And then last year we had the publication of the information note on alternative approaches to demonstrate compliance. Very helpful. It deals with things like, it explains the context of the technical guidance documents, the notion of alternative methods of proving things comply, proper materials. Very important. We kept forgetting that the materials, manufacturers, suppliers, they're part of this process, and also competence. Now, I'm not going to repeat this, but the only point I'll make, this is straight from SI 9. It says these regulations strengthen the current arrangements in place for the control of building activity. It's interesting language because we had regulations and probably the arrangements were unsatisfactory, and we had a lot of building failure. Nothing, well, spectacularly catastrophic, but it was unsatisfactory, and that's why we have the regulations, that's why we have the code, and the code is there to provide guidance. Jumping on, the code itself, I think the two things it says, it seems to stress that it's for the assigned certifier, and it is the assigned certifier who relies on this, and the assigned certifier is the person on point to collect the data and prove this compliance. So it gives practical guidance to everybody, and the bullet points that are listed in the code there are all of the participants, from the owner through to material suppliers, etc. So everybody has to read this, and sometimes I find people just want to read the bit that might apply to them if you're a designer. I'll just read that bit. But you have to read the whole thing, in my experience, to understand how it all joins up and works together. Each project is different. It's interesting as well, if you look at the Grenfell report, which was a catastrophic, tragic failure, that each of those functional participants is mentioned in one way or another as having a participative responsibility for Grenfell. So it applies to everybody in the process. Just briefly, obviously you get appointed as an assigned certifier. Generally it's a commercial contract. The scope of your appointment is always referenced back to the Code of Practice, and that's because it has a statutory basis. So I think it's really important that we as assigned certifiers and design certifiers, everybody relies on this to carry out their work properly and appropriately. And then the last bullet is really Maria just talking about, Jennifer talking about, is ancillary certification is vital to this. It's central to it. It can't happen. You won't get a good outcome without having decided on who's providing what certificates early. A lot of debate now around certification, but it needs to be done early. It can't be done at the end of the project. It can't be done as part of a safety file process. Design, again, Jennifer mentioned design is described in the code, and I won't read out what Jennifer explained to us. It is expanded on a little better, I think, under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work construction regulations, which where they define design, a design process different to this in a way, but they also define who a designer is. And I think the code could be perhaps a little clearer in its next iteration as to who the designer is. Generally, a few points before Joan is much clearer introducing what we do to us. I think that the issues current around the National Building Standards Regulator is very interesting. It's kind of 10 years on from this process, and looking at last year's steering group report, it looks like it's not quite there yet, but I think we do need a regulator. It's going to be different to the planning regulator, but it needs a regulator to join up all the various bits of this process, including NSAI, agreement certification, and these all need resources. So I think politically, we need a commitment to provide resources, physical, human, educational, money, etc. Modern methods of construction, we've had them some of them for a long time. Other newer, more lightweight systems present challenges to compliance, I think, and assessment. Alternative approaches, it's perhaps coincidental that the 2024 publication around alternative approaches coincided with the greatest pressure on the government to facilitate modern methods of construction. I could be wrong about that. Climate change, I think, is the one big thing in terms of compliance. I think fire, we always think about fire. Fire we're quite good at here in Ireland. I don't think there's enormous risk statistically, but the risks forward, I think, are Part L, Part F. There are serious targets being set by Europe in terms of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the Net Zero Act, and then there's people saying these cost too much. So these are big challenges over the next 5 years, and they will change things for us. Cost, I'm not going to talk about it, but the cost of compliance is frequently mentioned by owners and others. In terms of the Code of Practice, and I'll finish on this, what we might look at, what could be looked at again, I think, is the notion of absolute compliance, which is in the regulations, of course, which we can't change under a code. It is absolute, but the code does help people in working out what they say and who they rely on to determine a safe, there's no such thing as a perfect world. Absolute compliance has been proven in the courts under regulations not being possible, Ancillary design certification, designer definition, I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that the code clarifies that. The other thing is the disappearance of the design certifier on commencement. I think the code correctly says you should schedule what design is not complete at commencement. And in many projects, a lot of design is not completed. And it is a big issue because people are dodging around whether they're a designer or not. Specialist comes later. And the one point I'd make objectively about, and it was the RIAI and all the bodies came up with Practice Note 1. Practice Note 1 doesn't provide a certificate for somebody who arrives after commencement. That's an issue, but maybe that's for a later discussion. I think builder competence could be defined a little more clearly. It's defined in the Act. I think it could be restated a bit more strongly in the code. I think when we look at the British, UK legislation, post-Grenfell Building Safety Act, there's huge preoccupation with the owner's responsibility to appoint competent designers and builders, and that's for obvious reasons over there. And then the last thing, just speaking as an assigned certifier who signs it, the notion or the regulatory requirement that you are an individual, not a corporate entity, it places a huge restriction among engineering, architectural, surveying practices on who can sign. And I think that's an issue that could be addressed perhaps in legislation. So I'm going to hand over to Joan now. I've said enough. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. How are you? Thanks, Martin, for that, and thanks, Mairead, for chairing. So I am going to talk you through the Code of Practice, our own interpretation at Henry J Lyons, from inception through to completion, such that we can certify with confidence at the end of a job. So I would like to draw your attention, however, to what I think is one of the most important lines in the Code of Practice, which is that the overall objective of the revised building control system is to achieve better building construction. So ultimately, that is the primary purpose of this building control amendment regulations, and our project plan attempts to address that. So we go through this as a 6-stage process plan of service delivery, assigned certifier, service delivery over the life cycle of all of the projects we're involved on. And it has 6 stages which have documented activities, documentation and reporting identified at each of these gateway stages. So the stages are obviously stage 1, appraisal, stage 2, tender, then we have commencement, construction, pre-notification and completion. So part of this process looks at assessing risk in relation to BCAR at the appraisal and tender stages, and then we manage that risk for the remainder of the job through to completion. So we will look at how we implement the guidance that are outlined in the Code of Practice in terms of our roles and responsibilities of both the design and assigned certifier, in terms of our statutory obligations, how we generate our own records of inspections and the annex of documents, which we actually refer to as a supporting document list, or SDL, and the ancillary certificates upon which we rely to demonstrate our own assigned certifier's scope of services. So the assigned certifier service we provide is managed by a system which is ISO accredited and is independently assessed each year. So we do assess, and even we ourselves interpret and we implement changes to our own process as required. So our project plan addresses all aspects of the Code of Practice. It follows a very logical sequence through the construction process that is tailored to all of our jobs. So each of the 6 work stages address the necessary project management interaction and communication between us as assigned certifier, the builder, the owner and the building owner, the owner and the client, and the architect, who is often also the design certifier, and all ancillary certifiers, as well as ourselves, over the course of any project. So a key tenet of the Code of Practice is establishing and implementing an appropriate inspection regime for all ancillary certifiers. So if one of the key objectives of the Irish building control system is better quality building, then thorough and adequate inspection of the implementation of that building design in construction is a primary concern. So that is inspection by competent designers. We've heard a lot about competency, both from Mairead and from Martin. Competency is a key element of all of it. And those competent designers include those specialist subcontractors with design responsibility who are appointed by the main contractor. So the implementation of these stages will vary from time to time, depending on the job. But the assigned certifier is entirely reliant on the ancillary certification of those competent designers, and the BCAR process is therefore entirely one of collaboration. So we bring the design team on board with our BCAR process at this early stage. We also bring the builder on board through our BCAR process management system. So I'm going to go through each of these stages separately. So stage 1 is the appraisal. Now, the appraisal stage itself is not explicitly addressed in the Code of Practice, but the building owner, as has been alluded to, the building owner is, and I quote, there to ensure that adequate resources and competent persons are available to design, construct, inspect, and certify the building works. Now, this includes ourselves as assigned and assigned certifier. As you heard, we have to be ourselves a registered architect, a building surveyor or chartered engineer, and we must be competent ourselves in relation to the particular works involved. So we do like to get in early on a job as part of our role, because as part of our role as assigned certifier, we advise the client in terms of at project inception, in terms of building regulation compliance, designer appointments, construction contracts, and even agreements for development, lease or sale, which may involve a strategy for phased completion at the completion stage. So we do like to get in early to advise the client of their obligations under BCAR. The building owner is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the buildings and works are carried out in accordance with the building regulations. So we use our project plan then to outline the various roles and responsibilities and statutory obligations of everyone involved in the project at all stages of the process. So also getting involved early on in the job is made far more feasible by our being an integrated service within our larger architectural practice. So the conversation is quite easy because they're in the building with us. And it usually starts with the architect, and it starts at the design or tender stage, where the appointed design team are themselves looking towards implementation of the project on site. So we would then talk them through our project plan, and we introduce the design team at this stage to our risk assessment and compliance appraisal document. So that follows section 7.1.1 and section 7.1.2 of the Code of Practice, and it establishes basically a risk-based approach to inspections, okay, to inspection planning. So it immediately feeds into the design team preparation of their preliminary inspection plans at commencement. So stage 2 then, it's tender stage is at the point where we ask the design team to complete their risk assessment and compliance appraisal. So basically the risk assessment acts as a prompt for the design team to look at factors to determine their own inspection plans. So it was noted earlier, and it's correct, the assigned certifier prepares the preliminary inspection plan at commencement. However, what we really do is we collate the preliminary inspection plans from each of the design team members, and we add our own to that, because obviously we also carry out our own inspections and coordinate the inspections of others. So what we'd like to do is that the design team look at this risk assessment, and they use appropriate professional judgment to establish the frequency and extent of their site inspections. So carrying out the same risk assessment also triggers a conversation around design responsibility, because what you have to do is you have to formulate a review of the scope of the works by the design certifier. That is an element in the Code of Practice, that the design certifier must review the scope of works, and the conversation around design responsibility facilitates that. And it also allows for you to identify any design, as we've discussed, that is not yet completed at commencement. And that's in line with section 4.3 of the Code of Practice. So I'm going to look at those in more detail, but suffice to say, at tender, we also issue what is a BCAR preliminaries document, and that makes it very clear to the builder, because it's included in the tender package. So it makes it very clear to the builder what documentation is expected of the builder and their subcontractors to comply with the building regulations and to facilitate their BCAR process. So just to go through the risk assessment and compliance appraisal briefly. So yeah, like I said, it prompts the design team to identify factors in determining their inspection plan, and it looks at the following considerations. So it would look at the type of building, the type of construction, the builder expertise. It would look at how complicated the method of construction is. It would look at recent experience in interpreting or achieving compliance. It would look at potential for serious consequences depending on the complexity of the job. It would look at the practicality of subsequent inspections of items that are carried out on site. It would look at the speed of construction, and that includes consideration of modern methods of construction. It would look at the risk of significant failure of design of elements or components of the design. It would look at unusual designs, or again, unusual methods of construction, which could be, again, MMC. It looks at works related to fire safety and works which, if not inspected, could be detrimental to compliance. So really the purpose of carrying out the risk assessment is to work towards the preparation of the PIP, and it will assist in determining the inspection frequency and also those risk items for which a formal invitation to inspect is requested of the builder. So the inspection notification framework, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, is a document that outlines what elements of work the builder must actually invite the ancillary certifier to inspect on site prior to proceeding with the works. And risk assessment, again, feeds into that discussion. So the Code of Practice makes clear that the role of the design and the assigned certifier is confined to inspection. We are not there to supervise any builders. And in the case of the assigned certifier, the coordination of the inspection of others is critical. And both the PIP and the INF are critical to that function. So part 2 of the same document looks at compliance appraisal, and basically compliance appraisal is prompting each member of the design team to think about their own design input in relation to the TGDs. So to look at TGDs parts A to M, and they even fill out the section of the document related to that particular TGD in relation to their own design. Now, we do ask the design team to state their methods of confirming compliance, and we've had that question thrown back at us quite often. So we do suggest that the means of confirming compliance from the design team would simply be an inspection of the works as per their inspection plan and a review of the relevant submittals. So that's how we would suggest to the design team that that is how they demonstrate that they are compliant themselves in their design. So we also have our own templated design responsibility matrix. So obviously, risk assessment, again, also requires a clear definition of all design responsibilities of all design parties, and that will include design by specialist designers, including, for example, the external facade or piling or secondary steel. And in this way, risk assessment also starts the conversation on creating that design responsibility matrix. So our template DRM lists basically all the construction elements on the left-hand side as per the design team performance specification. Now, we formulated this template in consultation with consultancies that we work with quite often on a lot of our jobs who are from civil, structural, fire, DAC, facade and mechanical and electrical background. So we formulated a template, this generic template that is then tailored to suit the needs of each of the individual projects that we're involved in. And the objective of the design responsibility matrix is to establish that full list of specialist subcontractors with design responsibility as requested by the design team. Because if you think about it, at the tender stage, the design team are able to identify what elements of their own performance specifications relies on specialists for detailed development. And it will depend on the complexity and often on the scale of the project. And it is a fundamental building control compliance function that all designers must inspect the implementation of their design in accordance with the code of practice. So early identification of designers who will be ancillary certifiers and carry out construction inspections is very important for the assignment of contractual responsibility in tender. So central to the demonstration of that compliance is that those same specialist subcontractors must sign ancillary certificates of design and of inspection completion. And that must be considered as part of the tender package because the builder must be aware of whom they have to request this of when they are appointing their specialist subcontractors. So the DRM, as we call it, discussion, it also facilitates, like I said, a review of the entire scope of works by the design certifier. Again, that's section 4.3 of the code of practice. And it also allows the design certifier to identify where elements of the design have not yet been completed. So we discussed this briefly. So there will be some elements of the work that are not completed at the commencement stage. And a lot of the time that is work that is designed by the specialist subcontractor who is not yet appointed at the commencement stage. And that is required as part of the code of practice. So we always do insist, however, though, even though the design responsibility matrix may be included as part of the contract between the builder and the owner, we do insist that the DRM is itself a live document which may change during construction. So there may be some specialists added to it during construction, and indeed some design changes or some builder substitutions might mean that the specialist may be removed from a design responsibility matrix. So we do consider it a live document through construction, and we will continue to have discussions with the builder during construction around it. And there has been some industry pushback on the wording of the ancillary certificates of late, and there is perhaps an argument for an additional suite of design ancillary certificates for those specialist subcontractors who come on board post-commencement. There is maybe an argument for that, but it is important to note that all design, irrespective of when it takes place, must be certified. So that's the key point. And then at the commencement stage, that's been gone through quite well by Jennifer, so I don't need to labor upon it, but basically once the risk assessment and the compliance appraisal is complete, and once the specialists have now agreed and identified their specialist, or once the primary designers have agreed and identified the specialist designers, that will all be included as part of the tender pack, and it will be included in the contract between the client and the builder. Once that work is complete, the design certifier is then in a position to sign the design certificate at commencement. So that is the completion of their role as such. So once the builder is appointed and we've established a commencement date, we obtain all necessary BCMS information from the design team, including the Part L compliance information, all the commencement notice documentation, and we look at the status of the fire cert application, and depending on the status of the fire cert application, we would submit a 7-day notice or a standard notice. And then we do try to establish who the building control officer would be for the project, so we would remain as the single point of contact with the building control officer during construction. So the next stage then obviously is construction. So based on the information that was provided at the PIP, we engaged directly with the builder early on in construction to agree the inspection notification framework. So that document outlines, again, as I said, the elements of construction for which an invitation to inspect must be issued to the relevant ancillary certifier. And once this has been agreed with the design team, it is passed on to the builder for the builder to manage. So it's important to note that the builder is responsible for ensuring that these works are ready for inspection before they issue the invitation to inspect, and that they manage the inspection notification framework document, and they manage closeout of those inspection visits when they are carried out. So any items contained in the INF are usually first of a kind or benchmark inspections, which give the design team an opportunity to check compliance of a construction element that may be repeated, or if it's a life safety system, or if it's an element of non-typical construction. So there may be a requirement for several inspection invitations for the same item, for example, a pre-pour inspection in concrete, and the design team should provide information to the builder regarding what point in time they want the builder to issue the inspection. So that could be, for example, the inspection of fire doors pre the installation of the architrave. So you want the builder and the design team to be in close contact regarding the management of this INF, and it is something that we discuss and cover at every BCAR meeting as well, such that it is possible for the builder to carry out to issue the invitations in due time and to give 3 to 5 working days notice to the design team. So basically, aside from the items contained in the INF, then the design team also have to carry out their own regular scheduled site visits. So that's in line with their own preliminary inspection plan. And early warning is itself embedded in the code of practice requirements. So the builder should be advised by any designer of all workmanship or execution issues as and when they occur on site, as a means of both identifying non-compliant work and tracking any corrective measures, but also to proactively engage with a builder such as to mitigate or minimize any defective works, which could ultimately have an impact on the overall project delivery. So it is a collaborative process. The design team and the builders tend to have a good working relationship on all jobs I've been on. So it is, you're not trying to catch the builder out, you're simply trying to work with them in terms of building a building that is compliant with the building regulations. And also effective follow-up procedures are essential to check that the previously noted non-compliance issues have been corrected. So the person that is responsible for that particular inspection, whoever that ancillary certifier may be, or the assigned certifier, needs to follow up and check that those matters have been closed out satisfactorily. So records need to be kept of all site inspections and any test results, and the design team should continually update their inspection plans during construction with that information. So for example, even the dates of the inspection visits. We would chair a monthly BCAR meeting on site then, which we usually tag on to the site progress meeting just to get attendance. And these inspections are discussed, and we also discuss any closeout issues that arise. So the first BCAR meeting is where we would actually agree with the design team and the builder the means of uploading and tracking inspection reporting, usually by means of an online platform these days. So tracking of inspection reporting and remediation and closeout of any items raised by the design team is a critical element as part of the inspections process. So evidence of closeout of all non-compliance issues that are raised must be provided by the builder with both photographs and a narrative. I'm always clear to explain that to a builder. It can't just be, yes, it's closed. It has to be a photographic evidence that it has been closed out. And that has to be approved finally by the relevant design team member. And that is where an online shared platform such as Procore or AConX, which I'm sure you're familiar with, can be very useful. And even as a signed certifier, it means I can dial into that at any point in time in a job, and I can see where items are at in terms of closeout. So we continually update our SDL throughout construction, and in particular what happens during construction is the design team, and in particular the fire and mechanical and electrical consultants, will confirm that their testing and commissioning requirements. And so the SDL is a definitive list then of all requirements, all documentation required at completion. And it is that document which we use in our office to drive us towards completion. So I'm just going to briefly show you our assigned certifier report. We issue this monthly as well in line with our BCAR meetings. And basically what it is it's a snapshot of the project in time. It outlines all the inspection reports issued to date by all of the design team. It outlines a number of remediation items that are contained within those inspection reports and the status of those remediation items towards closeout. So where relevant, we would also document any Section 11 reports issued by the building control authorities, if necessary, and also any red flag items. So that's how we would do it. We use a traffic light system, as you can see. So the red flag systems, the red flag is simply a risk to certification. It's our own terminology and it's what we call it. But basically that risk to certification could be non-compliant design, or it could be non-compliant implementation of the design and construction, or it could be the non-issue of required documentation from the builder or their subcontractors. So that would be deemed a red flag in our reporting mechanism. These red flags are tracked in the same manner as an inspection item, so they must be closed out to the satisfaction of the relevant design team member who raised the red flag. That's very straightforward. Then at pre-notification, so there is obviously an option to pre-notify, and what you do then is you nominate a completion date. And this is usually discussed with the design team, with the client and the builder during construction, and is usually itself dependent on a number of factors. So you may have a job where there's a further fit out that might be expected on the job, or if the building may be subject to lease or sale. Now, a nominated date can offer certainty to a client or an end user for a definitive date, but there is always a risk attached to missing that nominated date, and care is advised when making the decision 3 to 5 weeks out from the nominated date as to whether or not the date is achievable. So advice should always be sought primarily from the builder, because they'll have an idea of programming, but also from the full design team as to their thinking toward the correct timing of the nominated completion date. And in particular, you should talk to the fire cert and the mechanical and electrical consultants. So we have on some jobs issued a BCAR completion strategy to the Building Control Authority in advance of pre-notification or completion. And this outlines the proposed means of completion, and it's particularly important in relation to phased completion or where a fit out might overlap a base build construction as we have on one of our jobs. So we are the single point of contact with the relevant building control officer, and we do maintain a good working relationship with them throughout construction and completion. So our experience has found that engaging with the building control authority on any proposed completion strategy is often far better than just making a submission unannounced. So the better and earlier you can engage with the building control authority towards completion, I feel is best advised. And if you are pre-notifying, then we do advise the builder to have a decent quantity of testing and commissioning documentation available at the point of nominating the completion date. The building control authorities are beginning to look for more information at the pre-notification date, so at the point of pre-notifying. So we do look for a specific testing and commissioning program that is reviewed by the design team and is then tracked by the builder all the way through to completion. So it's specifically related to testing and commissioning, because that's always the kind of filter point, as well as the point at which we get stuck. So we look for all updated design team inspection plans in progress, and we obtain all available ancillary certificates from all subcontractors whose work have been completed on the site. We confirm the status of all the fire cert and DACA grants, including obviously confirmation that all conditions on those are addressed, and we would update our SDL then prior to making the pre-notification submission. And then completion. So regardless of whether we've pre-notified or if we've made a standard CCC submission at completion, we will only ever upload the certificate of compliance on completion when the design team and the subcontractor ancillary certificates, including those for design, have all been obtained. And all inspection reports must be closed out at this point, and there must be documentary evidence of the closeout of those reports, and the design team again are responsible to ensure that. And all testing and commissioning, including cause and effect demonstrations, have been successfully completed. So if we have gone the pre-notification route, then the CCC is uploaded a minimum of 1 working day in advance of the nominated completion date. And we would include in that submission, in the CCC submission, all inspection plans as implemented from ourselves as the assigned certifier, but also from the full design team. So similarly with the PIP, we would collate the inspection plans as implemented from the full design team, add to it our own, and submit that as a single document. And for our own records, we also have to make sure we've obtained all other ancillary certificates, all testing and commissioning documentation documented as complete, all inspection reports closed out, including obviously demonstration that the documents include all remediation items as closed out. And we do ask the design team to issue their final construction issue drawings. And again, that would capture any design changes or anything that has changed since the commencement date. So those drawings at completion are important in that respect, and the changes are usually listed. So just to conclude, the amended building control regulations impose statutory obligations on the building owner, on the builder, and on designers. It is our role as the assigned certifier to make this clear at the outset of any job and to advise the client as to their duties and responsibilities in respect of any proposed building project. So our role is necessarily collaborative, and we bring the design team along with us in ascertaining what specialist subcontractors with design responsibility are required, such as to ensure, insofar as possible, that there are no gaps in certification at the end of a job. There is a very logical thought process at the inception of the BCAR process, where the risk assessment itself leads the design team to consider the extent and complexity of their inspection plan. And it also allows them to separate out all items for which an invitation to inspect is required as part of the inspection notification framework process. The risk assessment, which we think is quite an important part of the discussion, it lends itself to the design responsibility matrix discussion as well. So it is often far easier for a design team member to confirm what it is they are not certifying at that stage of a job. And that allows us to develop the list of specialist subcontractors with design responsibility for agreement with the builder, and it must be included in the tender package in order for the builder to price accordingly. So risk management continues throughout the job, right up until completion. So it continues up until you have obtained all relevant ancillary certificates on the job. And it naturally would include all ancillary certificates for inspection. Inspection is a key element of compliance. And all designers, regardless of whenever they are appointed or whenever they are carrying out the design, they must inspect the implementation of their design in construction. That's a very important point, and if it's the only point you take home, that's it. So if the inspection and certification is completed in accordance with the Code of Practice, then that will happily indicate prima facie compliance with the building regulations. So where there might be a disagreement on the wording of the ancillary certificates, I won't go into this in too much detail, but even where the choice of ancillary certificate types for elements of work carried out might be in dispute, there is maybe room for debate as to whether a further suite of design certificates might be created that specifically cater for those specialist subcontractors who were appointed post-commencement. So we are now over 10 years into the BCAR process, and we've formulated, all of us, an opinion as to whether it is successful or not, and we in HJL are no different. So we are constantly re-evaluating our own interpretation of the Code of Practice, and we use our own professional judgment with a view to continually improving our own assigned certifier service. So thank you all for your time and attention.